For most of human history, there were no villages, no streets, no permanent homes, no fences marking where one family ended and another began. Yet somehow, our species survived long enough to build every city, nation, and civilization that came later. The strange part is that people did not spend thousands of years waiting for villages to be invented. To them, a settled village would have seemed unusual, perhaps even restrictive. The way we live today feels normal to us, but for nearly all human existence, movement was normal instead. If staying in one place became one of the foundations of civilization, why did humans spend so much of their history living without it? If we could travel backward through time and continue moving deeper into the human past, one of the most surprising discoveries would not be something we found, but something we gradually lost. Villages would disappear from the landscape, roads would vanish, permanent houses, fences, and familiar neighborhoods would fade away, until eventually there was no trace of them at all, yet human beings would still be there. Long before the first villages appeared, long before cities, kingdoms, and written records, people were already living full and successful lives. This can feel strange because permanent settlements seem so closely connected to what we think of as civilization. Most people today grow up surrounded by buildings that remain in the same place for decades, sometimes centuries. We become accustomed to the idea that stability comes from staying put. We have addresses, property boundaries, and homes that are expected to remain where they are from one year to the next. Looking backward through history, it is easy to assume that human societies were always moving toward this way of life. Archaeology suggests something very different. Modern humans, known as Homo sapiens, are believed to have appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. The earliest widely accepted villages emerged only within the last 12,000 years, although the timing varied from one region to another. This means that more than 90% of human history took place before villages existed. For a far longer period than humans have lived in settled communities, they survived as small groups moving through landscapes that constantly changed with the seasons. Seen from this perspective, villages are not the beginning of the human story. They are a relatively recent development that occupies only the final portion of a much longer journey. For most of that journey, people lived as hunter-gatherers. Archaeologists use this term to describe societies that obtained food primarily from wild plants, animals, fish, shellfish, and other naturally available resources, rather than through farming. Although hunter-gatherer communities differed greatly across continents and climates, they shared an important connection to the natural rhythms of the environments around them. Food was rarely concentrated in one place throughout the entire year. Certain plants became available during particular seasons. Rivers provided fish at specific times. Herds of animals followed migration routes that changed across the landscape. Water sources expanded and contracted as weather patterns shifted. Because resources moved, people often moved as well. This did not mean their lives lacked structure or planning. In many ways, surviving in such conditions required an extraordinary understanding of the world around them. Evidence from archaeology and studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies suggests that people developed detailed knowledge of local environments. They remembered where water could be found during dry periods, where edible plants appeared during different seasons, and where animals were most likely to travel. Their knowledge was not organized around maps, street names, or permanent landmarks created by humans. Instead, it was built from generations of observation and experience. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, the first thing to understand is that they did not see themselves as waiting for villages to be invented. They were already living in a way that had allowed humans to spread across vast regions of Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. The absence of villages was not a problem that needed solving. For countless generations, it was simply the normal shape of human life, a way of living so familiar that the idea of remaining permanently in one place might have seemed far more unusual than movement itself. For most of human history, people did not live among hundreds or thousands of neighbors. The communities that carried human life across vast stretches of time were usually much smaller. Archaeologists cannot always determine the exact size of every ancient group, but evidence from archaeological sites, combined with studies of historically documented hunter-gatherer societies, suggests that many people spent their lives in bands consisting of a few dozen individuals. These were not anonymous populations. Most members knew one another personally. They shared food, knowledge, responsibilities, and memories. A child growing up in such a group would likely recognize every face around the camp. Elders would remember events from many years earlier. Skills were learned through observation and participation rather than through formal instruction. Life unfolded within a close circle of relationships that remained important for survival. The small size of these communities was not accidental. It reflected the realities of living from resources gathered directly from the natural world. A large group could quickly exhaust the plants, animals, or water available in one location. Smaller groups often had greater flexibility. They could move more easily, adapt to changing conditions, and take advantage of opportunities across a wider area. Movement itself was not necessarily constant. Many people did not wander aimlessly from place to place. Instead, evidence suggests that some groups followed familiar seasonal patterns, returning to certain regions repeatedly over many years and perhaps over many generations. The landscape became a network of remembered places rather than a single permanent settlement. A valley rich in edible plants might be visited during one season. A river known for fishing might become important during another. Sheltered locations could provide temporary homes during colder periods. These movements created rhythms that shaped daily life. In many ways, knowing when to move was just as important as knowing where to move. Cooperation played a central role in making this lifestyle possible. Hunting large animals, gathering food, caring for children, and maintaining tools often required people to work together. Archaeological evidence from sites containing shared hearths, communal activity areas, and distributed food remains suggests that cooperation was not merely helpful but essential. A successful hunt could provide more food than a single family needed, while periods of scarcity might require support from others. Sharing reduced risk in environments where resources could be unpredictable. This meant that social bonds were often as valuable as physical tools. Trust, reciprocity, and mutual support helped groups endure challenges that no individual could easily face alone. The absence of villages did not mean the absence of society. Human communities were already sophisticated long before permanent settlements emerged. They developed traditions, social expectations, and ways of organizing daily life that allowed people to function effectively within small groups. Knowledge about plants, animals, weather, routes, and seasonal changes was passed from one generation to the next. Decisions were made collectively in ways that varied from group to group, but survival depended on maintaining relationships and adapting to changing conditions. When we picture life before villages, it is tempting to imagine isolation, yet the evidence points towards something different. Most people lived surrounded by familiar companions, moving through landscapes they understood deeply, carrying with them not only tools and possessions but also a shared understanding of how to live in a world where permanence was rare. In that sense, the foundations of human community existed long before the first village was ever built, even if those communities left behind far fewer permanent traces on the land. Today, the phrase hunter-gatherer can sound like a simple label, almost as if it describes a single way of life shared by everyone before farming. In reality, it refers to an enormous span of human history and an extraordinary variety of communities that lived in different climates, landscapes, and time periods. People who lived along coastlines often depended heavily on fish, shellfish, and marine resources. Those living near rivers could take advantage of seasonal fish runs and freshwater animals. Groups occupying grasslands sometimes relied more heavily on hunting large mammals, while people in forests often gathered nuts, fruits, roots, and countless other plant foods. Archaeologists use the term hunter-gatherer not because these societies were identical, but because they obtained most of their food directly from wild resources rather than from cultivated crops or domesticated livestock. This distinction is important because it helps explain how humans lived before there were villages. Their survival depended not on controlling the land through agriculture, but on understanding the land in remarkable detail. A successful hunter-gatherer community was not simply collecting whatever happened to be nearby. Its members often possessed knowledge accumulated over generations. They knew which plants could be eaten safely and which could not. They understood where animals were likely to travel during different seasons. They recognized subtle environmental signs that revealed the presence of water, food, or shelter. To modernize, such knowledge might appear specialized, yet for most of human history, it formed the foundation of daily life. Imagine waking before sunrise in a world without permanent settlements. There is no field to inspect, no barn to maintain, and no village square waiting nearby. Instead, the day begins with decisions shaped by weather, season, and local resources. Some members of the group may search for edible plants. Others may track animals or inspect fishing locations. Children learn not from books, but by observing experienced adults. Elders contribute knowledge that cannot easily be replaced, remembering roots, seasonal patterns, and lessons gathered across decades of experience. Every activity is connected in some way to the landscape. The environment is not a distant backdrop to human life. It is an active partner in survival. This close relationship with nature helps explain why the hunter-gatherer lifestyle endured for such an immense period of time. From the perspective of modern civilization, farming may appear to be an obvious improvement, yet agriculture emerged surprisingly late in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer societies successfully adapted to changing climates, expanding into new regions and surviving challenges that would have been impossible without deep environmental knowledge. Archaeological evidence shows humans spreading across multiple continents long before villages became common. They crossed deserts, adapted to forests, occupied coastlines, and eventually entered regions that experienced severe seasonal cold. Such achievements were not signs of a primitive existence. They reflected a highly flexible way of living, capable of responding to diverse conditions. This is one reason researchers often caution against viewing hunter-gatherers as people who were somehow waiting for civilization to begin. They already possessed culture, social relationships, technologies, traditions, and systems of knowledge. What they lacked were permanent villages, not intelligence or complexity. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, the answer becomes clearer. They lived through movement rather than permanent settlement, through knowledge rather than ownership of land, and through close observation of natural cycles rather than dependence on cultivated fields. For generation after generation, this way of life allowed human communities not merely to survive, but to expand across much of the world. In fact, for the overwhelming majority of human existence, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was not an alternative to normal life. It was normal life itself, so familiar and successful that countless generations could scarcely imagine organizing society in any other way. When many people imagine life before villages, they picture human beings living almost entirely inside caves. It is an image that appears frequently in films, illustrations, and popular culture. Yet the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. Some people certainly used caves, and a number of famous prehistoric discoveries have been made inside them, but caves were never the universal home of early humans. In fact, for many communities, caves may have represented only one option among many. To understand how humans lived before there were villages, we must begin by setting aside the idea that everyone spent their lives deep inside rocky shelters. Most people likely lived much closer to the open landscape than that familiar image suggests. The challenge they faced was not finding a permanent house. The challenge was creating temporary places of safety wherever life happened to take them. A group moving through a river valley, forest, grassland, or coastal region needed protection from weather, wind, cold temperatures, and sometimes dangerous animals. The solution was often a shelter that could be built, repaired, abandoned, and rebuilt as circumstances changed. Archaeological evidence from different regions suggests that humans created a wide variety of temporary structures using materials available nearby. Wood, branches, animal hides, grasses, reeds, and other natural resources could all be used to form shelters. Most of these materials decay over time, which means they rarely survive in the archaeological record. As a result, ancient houses are often harder to find than ancient stone tools. Yet in some locations, traces remain. Patterns of post holes, concentrations of hearths, arrangements of stones, and preserved structural remains provide clues about the places where people once slept, cooked, rested, and gathered together. These shelters were not necessarily crude or random. Building a temporary home required practical knowledge. A poorly placed shelter might flood during rain or offer little protection from wind. A well-chosen location could make daily life far easier. People often selected places near water sources while avoiding obvious hazards. Access to food, fuel, and raw materials also influenced where camps were established. Even without permanent buildings, communities developed a deep understanding of what made a good place to stay. In this sense, home was less about ownership and more about familiarity. A successful campsite might be revisited many times over the years. Generations could return to the same valley, riverbank, or sheltered hillside because experience had shown it to be reliable. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that some locations were occupied repeatedly across long periods, even though no permanent village existed there. This pattern reveals an important detail about life before villages. Mobility did not mean randomness. People often moved within landscapes they knew intimately, returning to places that had proven valuable in the past. The hearth was frequently at the center of these temporary homes. Evidence of ancient fires appears at many archaeological sites and offers a glimpse into daily life. Around a hearth, food could be prepared, warmth maintained, tools repaired, and stories shared. The shelter itself might disappear over thousands of years, but traces of the fire often remain. Through these remnants, archaeologists can sometimes reconstruct the outlines of camps that once supported entire communities. Looking back across the immense span of human history before villages, it becomes clear that home was not necessarily a fixed structure standing in one place year after year. Home could be a temporary shelter beside a river, a camp overlooking a grassland, a protected area near a coastline, or a familiar location revisited season after season. For countless generations, humans did not define home by permanence. They defined it by the ability to create safety, comfort, and community wherever the journey of life happened to lead them. Caves occupy a special place in the story of human history, partly because they preserve evidence so well. When archaeologists uncover ancient tools, hearths, animal bones, pigments, or traces of human activity that are tens of thousands of years old, many of those discoveries come from caves and rock shelters. This can create the impression that caves were the primary homes of prehistoric people. The reality is likely more nuanced. The reason caves appear so frequently in archaeological research is not necessarily because people spent most of their lives in them, but because caves are unusually good at protecting evidence from the destructive forces of time. Rain, wind, flooding, vegetation, and human activity can erase traces of open-air camps over thousands of years. Inside a cave, however, objects may remain sheltered for much longer periods. Layers of sediment can accumulate gradually, preserving evidence that would have disappeared almost everywhere else. In a sense, caves act as natural archives. They have given modern researchers some of the clearest windows into the distant human past. Yet the survival of evidence should not be confused with the frequency of its original use. Imagine two camps occupied by the same group many thousands of years ago. One is established in an open meadow near a river. The other is located beneath a rocky overhang. After enough centuries pass, the meadow camp may leave only faint traces or disappear entirely, while the sheltered site continues preserving evidence layer after layer. Thousands of years later, archaeologists are far more likely to discover the protected location. As a result, the archaeological record naturally favors places where preservation conditions are good. Understanding this helps answer an important question about how humans lived before there were villages. The evidence we find today is not always a perfect reflection of how often different places were used. It is partly shaped by which traces happened to survive. This means that the famous cave sites known around the world may represent only a portion of a much larger pattern of human movement and habitation. Even so, caves could be valuable places when circumstances made them useful. They offered protection from wind, rain, and temperature extremes. Some provided elevated viewpoints over surrounding landscapes. Others were located near water sources, animal migration routes, or important natural resources. For groups living without permanent villages, such advantages could make a cave an attractive temporary home during certain seasons or under particular conditions. Evidence from different regions suggests that some caves were occupied repeatedly over long periods, with generations returning to the same locations because they remained useful. Yet these occupations were often intermittent rather than continuous. A cave might be used for weeks, months, or a season before a group moved elsewhere. The rhythms of hunter-gatherer life frequently involved movement, and even excellent shelters were only one part of a larger network of places that people knew and revisited. Some caves appear to have held significance beyond simple shelter. Archaeological discoveries of cave art, pigments, engraved objects, and other unusual materials suggest that certain locations may have carried cultural or symbolic importance. While researchers continue to debate the precise meanings behind many of these findings, they remind us that caves were not merely places to sleep. They could also serve as locations where communities gathered, expressed ideas, and left traces of their experiences. Still, it is important not to let these remarkable sites dominate our imagination. For most of human history before villages, people likely spent much of their lives moving through open landscapes, building temporary shelters, following seasonal opportunities, and adapting to changing environments. The caves that survive in the archaeological record are invaluable sources of knowledge, but they represent only the portions of the story that time happened to preserve. Beyond their entrances stretched a much larger world, one in which countless camps, shelters, and daily activities vanished long ago, leaving behind only faint clues to how humans lived before permanent settlements became part of the human experience. For people living in the modern world, the idea of home is often connected to a specific structure. It may be a house, an apartment, or a room filled with familiar possessions. We expect home to remain in the same location from one day to the next. We can leave it in the morning and return to it in the evening. Addresses, property boundaries, and permanent buildings reinforce this feeling of stability. Yet for most of human history, before villages existed, the meaning of home was likely very different. Home was not necessarily a fixed place waiting in the landscape. Instead, it may have been something carried within relationships, memories, and shared experiences. This difference is important because it helps us understand how humans could live successfully for thousands upon thousands of years without permanent settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests that many hunter-gatherer groups returned repeatedly to certain locations. A riverside camp used during one season might be visited again the following year. A sheltered valley could become a familiar stopping point for generations. A productive fishing area might remain important long after the individuals who first used it had passed away. These places were not villages in the later sense. They did not necessarily contain permanent buildings or year-round populations. Yet they were far from anonymous points on a landscape. They carried memories. People knew what had happened there before. They remembered successful hunts, difficult winters, gatherings with relatives, and lessons passed from elders to younger generations. In this way, the land itself became woven into social memory. A familiar location could provide a sense of continuity, even when people were constantly moving between different camps. The concept of belonging may also have been tied more closely to people than to structures. In a small hunter-gatherer community, daily life unfolded among individuals who shared knowledge, responsibilities, and survival. Children grew up surrounded by relatives and familiar companions. Skills were learned from trusted adults. Stories connected the present generation to those who had come before. Wherever these relationships existed, a sense of home could exist as well. If a group relocated to a new camp, the social world that gave meaning to everyday life moved with them. The shelter might change, but the community remained. This helps explain why mobility did not necessarily create insecurity. Modern assumptions often lead us to associate movement with instability, yet for many prehistoric people, movement may have represented a normal and expected part of life. Familiar routes connected familiar places. Seasonal journeys followed patterns that had been learned and refined over generations. Rather than wandering into the unknown, people often traveled through landscapes they understood deeply. Every valley, water source, shoreline, and hillside could carry practical knowledge accumulated over centuries. In this sense, the world before villages was not empty or unfamiliar. It was filled with meaningful places linked together through memory and experience. Archaeologists occasionally find evidence that certain locations were revisited over remarkably long periods. Layers of occupation separated by years or centuries suggest that some places remained important long after individual camps had disappeared. Such discoveries hint at an enduring connection between people and landscape that existed before permanent settlements became common. The relationship was different from modern ownership. A place could matter profoundly without containing a permanent house. It could remain significant because of what people remembered, shared, and expected to find there when they returned. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we often focus on shelters, food, and survival. Those things were certainly important, yet there was also a human need for familiarity, belonging, and continuity. Before streets, addresses, and permanent neighborhoods, people found those things in a combination of trusted companions, remembered landscapes, and places that welcomed them back again and again. For countless generations, home was not simply where a building stood. Home was where knowledge, memory, and community came together, even if the physical traces of that home vanished long ago. Long before fields of wheat, rice, or barley stretched across the landscape, humans were already finding enough food to survive, raise children, and expand into new parts of the world. When modern people think about obtaining food, it is easy to imagine hunting as the central activity of prehistoric life. Dramatic images of hunters pursuing large animals have captured attention for generations. Yet archaeological evidence and studies of many hunter-gatherer societies suggest that plant foods often played a much larger role in daily survival than popular imagination assumes. Before villages existed, and before agriculture transformed human societies, much of life revolved around understanding the natural abundance hidden within forests, grasslands, wetlands, river valleys, and coastal environments. The world was not an empty wilderness waiting to be cultivated. It was a living landscape filled with edible resources for those who knew where and when to look. Wild fruits, nuts, seeds, roots, tubers, leaves, and countless other plants provided calories and nutrients throughout much of the year. The challenge was not simply finding food. The challenge was knowing which foods were available during particular seasons and how to gather them efficiently. This knowledge was among the most valuable possessions a community could have. A person who understood the landscape could recognize subtle signs that others might overlook. Certain plants appeared only at specific times. Some roots were easiest to collect after rainfall. Certain trees produced nuts in greater quantities during particular years. Small differences in weather could influence what resources were available and where they could be found. Such knowledge was accumulated slowly across generations, refined through observation and shared through experience. In a world before written records, survival depended heavily on memory. Children likely began learning these lessons at an early age, accompanying older members of the community as they moved through familiar environments. What appeared to be an ordinary walk across the landscape was often an education in food, seasons, and survival. Archaeological discoveries increasingly support the importance of plant foods in ancient diets. While plant remains are often more difficult to preserve than bones, evidence from microscopic residues, preserved seeds, grinding stones, and other sources reveals that prehistoric people made extensive use of wild vegetation. Some communities processed seeds into meals or coarse flours long before formal agriculture emerged. Others relied on nutritious roots and tubers that could be dug from the ground using simple tools. Along coastlines and wetlands, edible plants sometimes supplemented fish and shellfish, creating diverse food sources that reduced dependence on any single resource. This variety offered an important advantage. If one food became scarce, alternatives might still be available. Such flexibility helped hunter-gatherer communities adapt to changing environmental conditions. Understanding this helps answer a central question of our journey. How did humans live before there were villages? Part of the answer lies in their ability to see opportunities in landscapes that modern eyes might overlook. A meadow was not merely open space. A forest was not simply a collection of trees. Each environment contained layers of information about food, water, and seasonal change. Communities learned to read these patterns with remarkable skill. Their survival depended not on planting fields but on recognizing what nature was already producing. This relationship required patience and attentiveness rather than ownership. No fence marked where food began or ended. Instead, people moved through landscapes shaped by natural cycles, gathering resources as they became available. For countless generations, this approach provided enough nourishment to sustain human life. Before villages, before farms, and before permanent settlements, people relied on an intimate understanding of wild plants that modern societies often take for granted. In many ways, the success of early humans depended not only on their ability to hunt, but also on their ability to notice, remember, and make use of the quiet abundance growing all around them. While wild plants provided a reliable foundation for many hunter-gatherer diets, they were only part of a much larger picture. Long before villages appeared, humans also obtained food from animals, fish, and countless other sources found across the natural world. Popular culture often presents prehistoric hunting as a constant sequence of dramatic pursuits, with hunters chasing large animals across open landscapes every day. The archaeological evidence suggests a quieter and more complex reality. Successful hunting usually depended less on speed and excitement than on patience, observation, planning, and cooperation. A hunter needed to understand the habits of animals in much the same way that gatherers understood the rhythms of plants. Different species moved through the landscape according to seasonal patterns, availability of water, weather conditions, and breeding cycles. Learning these patterns took years of experience. A person who knew where animals tended to drink, rest, migrate, or seek shelter possessed valuable knowledge that could improve the chances of success. In many environments, the hunt may have begun long before anyone picked up a spear or other tool. It began with observation. Tracks in soft ground, broken vegetation, droppings, and subtle changes in the landscape could reveal information that modern people might overlook entirely. Such details helped hunters make decisions about where to travel and when to act. Archaeological discoveries indicate that humans developed a variety of hunting methods over time. These methods differed across regions and periods, reflecting local conditions and available prey. Some communities focused on smaller animals, while others occasionally hunted larger game. Cooperation often increased the likelihood of success. Working together allowed groups to share information, coordinate movements, and distribute risk. Even when a hunt failed, cooperation helped communities endure because food resources could be shared among members of the group. This social aspect is important when considering how humans lived before there were villages. Survival was rarely an individual achievement. It was usually a collective effort, supported by relationships built over many years. Yet hunting was only one source of animal food. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and coastlines offered additional opportunities that were often more predictable than pursuing large land animals. Archaeological evidence from many regions reveals the long history of fishing and the gathering of aquatic resources. Fish bones, shell remains, hooks, nets, and other tools demonstrate that water environments could provide substantial amounts of food. In some locations, seasonal fish migrations created periods of abundance that communities learned to anticipate. A river that seemed ordinary during one part of the year might become an exceptionally productive source of food during another. Coastal areas offered shellfish and other marine resources that could often be collected with less risk than hunting large animals. These diverse food sources helped reduce uncertainty. If one resource became scarce, another might remain available. Flexibility was one of the greatest strengths of hunter-gatherer societies. Rather than depending entirely on a single crop or food source, they often drew from a wide range of plants, animals, fish, and seasonal opportunities. This adaptability allowed human communities to survive in environments that differed enormously from one another. It also helps explain how people managed to live successfully for such a long period before villages and agriculture became common. Their survival depended on understanding entire ecosystems rather than controlling a small piece of land. Every landscape offered different possibilities, and people learned to recognize them. A river was not merely a source of water. A coastline was not simply the edge of the sea. A grassland was not just open terrain. Each environment contained potential food for those who possessed the knowledge to find it. Before villages existed, human life was closely connected to these natural patterns. Through observation, cooperation, and accumulated experience, communities transformed the resources around them into a dependable means of survival, proving that a settled village was not necessary for people to build successful and enduring ways of life. For people living before villages, food was never just something placed on a table at the end of the day. Food shaped movement, decisions, and even the rhythm of the year itself. A modern community can often remain in one place because food is transported from distant regions. Roads, ships, markets, and storage systems make it possible for people to stay where they are while resources come to them. Hunter-gatherer communities lived in a very different world. In that world, people often had to go where the resources were. This simple reality influenced nearly every aspect of life. A valley that provided abundant food during one season might become far less productive during another. A river rich with fish at a certain time of year could offer much less food months later. Herds of animals moved across large territories, following weather patterns, fresh vegetation, and water sources. Wild plants appeared, ripened, and disappeared according to seasonal cycles that repeated year after year. To survive successfully, people learned to move with these changes rather than resist them. Archaeological evidence from many parts of the world suggests that movement was often organized and predictable rather than random. Communities developed detailed knowledge of the places they visited and the times when those places were most useful. Certain camps might be occupied during warmer months when nearby resources were plentiful. Other locations could become important during colder seasons. Over many generations, these movements formed familiar routes across landscapes that people knew intimately. A journey that might appear uncertain to an outsider could feel entirely normal to those who had traveled it since childhood. Every stop along the way carried practical knowledge. People remembered where water could usually be found, where animals tended to gather, where useful plants grew, and where shelter was available if weather conditions changed suddenly. This knowledge reduced risk and increased the likelihood of finding food throughout the year. In many ways, the landscape functioned almost like a living calendar. Changes in temperature, rainfall, plant growth, animal behavior, and daylight all provided information about what resources might soon become available. Those who understood these patterns could make better decisions about when to stay and when to move. Such decisions were rarely made lightly. Moving a community required effort and planning. Tools, possessions, children, and accumulated knowledge all traveled together. Yet, remaining too long in one place could create problems of its own. Local resources might become depleted. Nearby game could become harder to find. Edible plants might no longer be available in sufficient quantities. Movement, therefore, became a practical solution rather than an inconvenience. It allowed people to take advantage of new opportunities while reducing pressure on any single location. This relationship between food and movement helps explain one of the most important aspects of life before villages. Human communities were not simply wandering because they lacked permanent settlements. They were responding intelligently to environments that changed throughout the year. Their movements reflected an understanding of natural cycles developed through countless generations of observation. In many regions, this approach proved remarkably successful for thousands of years. It enabled people to live across deserts, forests, grasslands, mountains, coastlines, and river systems long before agriculture became widespread. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we often imagine what they built, what they wore, or where they slept. Equally important is understanding how they followed food through the landscape. Resources determined where people gathered, where they rested, and when they moved on. The path of a migrating herd, the ripening of wild fruits, the arrival of fish in a river, or the seasonal growth of edible plants could influence the movements of an entire community. Before villages anchored people to one location, the search for food helped shape a way of life built around flexibility, memory, and an ongoing conversation with the natural world. One of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining life before villages is to assume that people moved because they preferred movement itself. In reality, movement was often a response to a world that never stood still. Long before roads, permanent settlements, and stored harvests reduced the influence of seasonal change, human life was deeply connected to the rhythms of the year. The arrival of spring, summer, autumn, and winter was not simply a matter of temperature. Each season altered the availability of food, water, shelter, and opportunities for survival. To understand how humans lived before there were villages, it is important to understand that they inhabited a world where the landscape itself seemed to transform throughout the year. A valley that appeared rich and welcoming during one season could become far less useful during another. Plants emerged, flowered, produced seeds or fruit, and then disappeared. Animals changed their behavior in response to weather and food availability. Rivers rose and fell, wetlands expanded and contracted. Even coastlines could offer different opportunities depending on the time of year. For people whose food came directly from the natural world, these changes could not be ignored. Survival depended on recognizing them and responding accordingly. Archaeological evidence suggests that many hunter-gatherer communities organized their movements around seasonal cycles. Rather than remaining in a single location and waiting for resources to return, they often traveled between places that were useful at different times of the year. A particular region might offer abundant plant foods during one season and excellent hunting opportunities during another. A sheltered location could become important during colder months, while a more open area might be favored when temperatures were mild. Over generations, people learned these patterns in remarkable detail. The timing of a journey could be just as important as its destination. Leaving too early or too late might mean missing an important food source. Knowledge of seasonal change, therefore, became one of the most valuable forms of information a community could possess. Children learned these rhythms from older generations, gradually building an understanding of the environment that extended far beyond any single campsite. This seasonal way of life also influenced how people thought about place. Modern societies often expect permanence. We build structures designed to remain standing year after year, and we often judge a location by its usefulness across all seasons. Hunter-gatherer communities frequently approach the landscape differently. A place did not need to provide everything all year long to be valuable. It only needed to provide the right resources at the right time. As a result, people often developed relationships with many locations rather than becoming attached to a single permanent settlement. Familiar routes connected familiar places, creating a network of seasonal destinations spread across the landscape. What may appear to modern eyes as constant movement was often a carefully structured cycle repeated over many years. This flexibility offered important advantages. If environmental conditions changed unexpectedly in one area, people could sometimes rely on knowledge of alternative locations. Diversity itself became a form of security. Instead of depending entirely on a single place, communities drew resources from multiple environments throughout the year. This strategy helped humans survive periods of environmental uncertainty that might have been far more difficult for a completely settled population. When we ask why humans did not simply stay in one place before villages existed, the answer is often found in the changing seasons. The natural world was constantly shifting, and successful communities adapted to those shifts rather than resisting them. Movement was not necessarily a sign of instability. In many cases, it was a sophisticated response to environmental realities. For thousands upon thousands of years, long before permanent villages became common, people followed the rhythms of the seasons through landscapes they knew intimately, building lives that were shaped not by fixed boundaries, but by an ongoing awareness of how the world changed. If the changing seasons helped determine when people moved, animals and water often helped determine where they moved. Before villages, before farms, and before large stores of preserved food, human communities were closely connected to the movements of the living world around them. In many regions, some of the most important sources of food were not stationary. Herds of animals traveled across landscapes in search of fresh vegetation, water, breeding grounds, or more favorable weather conditions. For the people who depended on these animals, understanding such movements could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. Archaeological evidence from numerous parts of the world suggests that humans became exceptionally skilled observers of animal behavior. They learned not only what animals ate, but also when they moved, where they gathered, and how environmental changes influenced their routes. A herd crossing a valley was not merely a passing event. It was part of a larger pattern that experienced observers could recognize and anticipate. Knowledge accumulated over generations allowed communities to predict where animals might appear at different times of the year. This understanding transformed the landscape into a network of opportunities connected by movement. In some regions, following animal migrations likely became a recurring feature of life. Rather than remaining in one location and hoping food would arrive, people often positioned themselves where resources were expected to be. Such decisions required patience and memory. Routes had to be remembered. Seasonal timing had to be understood. Environmental clues had to be interpreted correctly. The success of an entire community could depend on the accuracy of this knowledge. Yet animals were only part of the story. Water was equally important, and in many cases, even more fundamental. Every living thing depended upon it. Humans, animals, and plants were all drawn toward reliable sources of fresh water. Rivers, lakes, springs, wetlands, and seasonal pools became focal points within the landscape. People often established camps near water because it supported multiple needs at once. It provided drinking water, attracted animals, encouraged plant growth, and offered opportunities for fishing and gathering other aquatic resources. In many environments, knowing where water could be found during dry periods was among the most valuable forms of knowledge a community possessed. Some water sources remained dependable year after year, while others changed dramatically with seasonal rainfall. A stream that flowed strongly during one season might shrink or disappear during another. Wetlands could expand after heavy rains and contract during droughts. Communities learned to recognize these patterns and adjust their movements accordingly. This relationship between water and movement can be difficult to appreciate in modern societies, where water often arrives through pipes and infrastructure. For most of human history, however, access to water influenced where people traveled, where they rested, and how long they could remain in a particular place. The paths of animals and the locations of water frequently intersected, creating areas of exceptional importance. A river valley, for example, might attract fish, birds, grazing animals, edible plants, and human communities all at the same time. Such locations often became recurring destinations within seasonal cycles of movement. Generations returned because the landscape consistently provided opportunities for survival. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we begin to see that their lives were shaped by forces larger than any individual decision. The movement of herds, the flow of rivers, the arrival of rains, and the changing availability of water all influenced the paths people followed. Rather than imposing fixed boundaries upon the land, communities adapted themselves to these natural patterns. They learned to anticipate them, remember them, and pass that knowledge to future generations. For thousands of years, long before villages anchored people to permanent locations, the movements of animals and the presence of water helped guide the movements of humans as well, weaving people into the same living systems that sustained every other form of life around them. From a modern perspective, a life built around movement can sometimes appear fragile. We often associate permanence with security. A house made of stone seems safer than a temporary shelter. A fixed address seems more stable than a seasonal route. A village appears more dependable than a camp that may be occupied for only part of the year. Yet when we look across the immense span of human history, a different picture begins to emerge. For hundreds of thousands of years, long before the first villages appeared, mobility was not a sign of weakness. It was one of humanity's greatest strengths. The ability to move allowed people to respond to challenges that a permanently settled population might have struggled to survive. Climate changed repeatedly throughout prehistory. Temperatures rose and fell. Rainfall patterns shifted. Forests expanded into some regions and retreated from others. Grasslands appeared where different environments had once existed. Rivers changed course. Coastlines moved as sea levels rose and fell. In such a world, flexibility was often more valuable than permanence. Communities that could adapt their movements to changing conditions possessed an important advantage. They were not tied completely to a single location. If resources became scarce in one area, knowledge of alternative places offered additional possibilities. This flexibility helped human populations endure environmental changes that unfolded over generations and sometimes across entire continents. Archaeological evidence shows that humans gradually spread into an extraordinary range of environments long before villages became common. They occupied tropical forests, dry deserts, mountain regions, open grasslands, river valleys, coastlines, and areas affected by severe seasonal cold. Such expansion would have been difficult without a lifestyle capable of adapting to diverse conditions. Mobility allowed communities to take advantage of opportunities wherever they appeared. Rather than waiting for the landscape to conform to their needs, people learned how to adjust themselves to the realities of each environment. This required knowledge, planning, cooperation, and experience. It was not a simple way of life, nor was it an accidental one. It represented a sophisticated strategy refined over countless generations. Movement also helped distribute pressure across the landscape. A permanently settled population that relies on local resources can sometimes exhaust those resources if alternatives are unavailable. Hunter-gatherer communities often reduce this risk by drawing food and materials from multiple locations throughout the year. As people moved, ecosystems had opportunities to recover, plants could regrow, animal populations could continue their natural cycles. Resources that had been used during one season might become productive again by the time people returned. Although prehistoric communities undoubtedly affected their environments in various ways, their mobility often created a different relationship with the land than that found in later agricultural societies. Understanding this helps answer a deeper question hidden within the title of our journey. How did humans live before there were villages? They lived through adaptation rather than permanence. They relied on knowledge rather than extensive infrastructure. They responded to changing conditions rather than expecting conditions to remain the same. The absence of villages did not prevent people from building successful communities, raising families, sharing knowledge, caring for children, or developing rich cultural traditions. In fact, the mobile way of life supported human survival for far longer than village life has existed. This does not mean villages were unimportant when they eventually appeared. Permanent settlements would bring profound changes to human history, opening new possibilities while creating new challenges. But those developments belong to a much later chapter. For most of the human story, movement was not a temporary stage on the road toward something better. It was a highly effective solution to the realities of the natural world. Generation after generation, people followed familiar routes through landscapes they understood deeply, carrying with them the knowledge, relationships, and traditions that made survival possible. Long before walls, streets, and permanent homes reshaped human life, mobility itself was one of the foundations upon which our species built its success. Before villages brought large numbers of people together in permanent settlements, most human beings spent their lives in much smaller communities. The world they knew was not filled with strangers. It was filled with familiar faces. A child born into a hunter-gatherer group would likely grow up surrounded by people whose voices, habits, and stories became deeply familiar from an early age. Grandparents, parents, siblings, cousins, and other companions formed the social world within which daily life unfolded. Although the exact structure of families varied across cultures and time periods, archaeological evidence and observations of historically documented hunter-gatherer societies suggest that close personal relationships were among the most important resources a community possessed. Before villages, survival depended not only on finding food and shelter, but also on maintaining strong social bonds. In a small group, every person mattered. The skills, knowledge, and experience carried by each individual contributed to the well-being of others. An elder who remembered seasonal routes, a skilled toolmaker, an experienced gatherer, or a successful hunter could all provide benefits that extended far beyond themselves. Knowledge was rarely stored in books or permanent records. Instead, it lived within people. This made relationships especially valuable because learning often occurred through daily interaction. Children did not attend schools in the modern sense. They learned by watching, listening, helping, and participating. A young child accompanying adults during routine activities might gradually absorb an enormous amount of information about plants, animals, weather patterns, tool use, and social expectations. Education was woven into everyday life. The landscape itself became a classroom, and nearly every adult could serve as a teacher in one way or another. Life within these communities was likely characterized by a high degree of cooperation. Gathering food, caring for children, constructing shelters, maintaining fires, and transporting possessions often required shared effort. Archaeologists cannot directly observe conversations that took place tens of thousands of years ago, yet evidence from both prehistoric sites and hunter-gatherer societies studied in more recent times suggests that cooperation played a central role in human success. No individual could easily possess all the skills needed to survive under every circumstance. Communities became stronger when knowledge and labor were shared. This interdependence shaped family life as well. Childcare, for example, was often not the responsibility of only one or two adults. In many small communities, children benefited from the attention and support of multiple relatives and trusted companions. Such arrangements may have helped parents balance the many tasks required for survival, while ensuring that younger members of the group remained protected and cared for. This broader network of support is sometimes described by researchers as one of the distinctive features of human social life. It allowed knowledge, responsibility, and care to be distributed across a wider circle of people. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it is easy to focus on shelters, food sources, and movement across the landscape. Yet family relationships were equally important. The small communities that carried humanity through most of its history were built not only upon practical survival skills, but also upon trust, cooperation, and long-term social connections. A person might move from one camp to another throughout the year, but the community often moved together. Familiar companions remained nearby even as locations changed. In this way, continuity came not from permanent buildings, but from enduring relationships. Long before streets, neighborhoods, and villages provided a sense of belonging, human beings found that belonging within the people who shared their journeys, their knowledge, and their daily lives. Long before classrooms, textbooks, and formal lessons became part of human life, children still had an enormous amount to learn. In some ways, the challenge was even greater than it is today. A mistake in identifying a plant, misunderstanding an animal's behavior, or failing to recognize signs of changing weather could have serious consequences. Yet for hundreds of thousands of years, human communities successfully passed essential knowledge from one generation to the next without writing systems, schools, or permanent institutions. Before villages existed, education was woven into everyday life so completely that it was often impossible to separate learning from living. A child growing up in a hunter-gatherer community was surrounded by opportunities to observe skilled adults. Knowledge was not stored on shelves or recorded in books. It lived in actions, habits, memories, and conversations. As children accompanied older members of the group through forests, grasslands, river valleys, and coastal regions, they gradually learned how the world worked. They learned which plants could be eaten safely and which should be avoided. They learned where water was likely to be found during dry periods. They learned how animals moved across the landscape and how changing seasons affected the availability of food. Much of this learning happened quietly through observation. Children watched what experienced adults did and slowly practiced those skills themselves. Archaeologists cannot directly observe childhood from tens of thousands of years ago, but evidence from many hunter-gatherer societies studied in more recent times suggests that children often gained increasing responsibility as they grew older. Younger children might begin with simple tasks close to camp, gradually developing confidence and competence. Over time, they learn to contribute to food gathering, tool maintenance, childcare, and other activities essential to community life. Learning was not necessarily rushed. Human childhood is unusually long compared to that of many other animals, and researchers believe this extended period of development may have helped humans acquire the complex knowledge needed to survive in diverse environments. The process required patience from both children and adults. Skills accumulated gradually through years of experience rather than through short periods of instruction. Stories likely played an important role as well. Long before written records existed, spoken traditions helped preserve information across generations. A story shared beside a fire could contain practical lessons about landscapes, animals, weather, cooperation, and social expectations. Memory became one of the most valuable tools a community possessed. Through stories, songs, and repeated experiences, knowledge that had taken generations to acquire could continue guiding future generations. This transfer of knowledge was essential because life before villages depended heavily upon understanding local environments. A community that forgot where resources could be found or failed to recognize seasonal patterns would face greater risks. Children, therefore, inherited more than tools and possessions. They inherited accumulated wisdom about how to live within a particular landscape. Family members, elders, and other trusted adults all contributed to this process. In many cases, learning extended beyond biological parents and involved a broader network of relatives and companions. Such cooperation increased the chances that important knowledge would survive, even if individual members of the group were lost. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we must remember that survival depended not only on food and shelter, but also on the successful transmission of knowledge. Every generation faced the task of preparing the next. Before schools existed, the landscape itself served as a classroom. Before written lessons existed, experience served as a teacher. Through observation, participation, storytelling, and patient guidance, children learned how to navigate a world without permanent settlements. Those lessons helped ensure that the knowledge accumulated over thousands of years continued moving forward, carried not by books or buildings, but by people themselves. In a world without villages, daily life was shaped by a simple reality. Survival depended on the combined efforts of many people rather than the work of a single individual. Every day brought practical tasks that helped sustain the community, and while the exact division of labor varied across different societies and environments, archaeological evidence and observations of hunter-gatherer groups suggest that cooperation was one of the most important foundations of life. There were shelters to maintain, fires to tend, food to gather, tools to repair, children to supervise, and knowledge to pass on. Unlike modern societies, where many essential services are provided by distant institutions, small prehistoric communities often performed these responsibilities themselves. The people around you were not simply neighbors. They were the individuals whose skills and efforts directly influenced the well-being of everyone else. A successful day rarely belonged to one person alone. It was usually the result of many contributions working together. Some members of the community might spend time gathering edible plants, seeds, fruits, or roots. Others might search for fish, shellfish, or game. Someone needed to maintain tools made from stone, bone, wood, or other natural materials. Fires required attention because they provided warmth, light, protection, and a means of preparing food. Children needed guidance and supervision as they gradually learned the skills required for adulthood. Older individuals, even if they were no longer able to perform physically demanding tasks, often remained valuable sources of knowledge and experience. In such communities, usefulness was not measured only by physical strength. Memory, judgment, and accumulated understanding could be equally important. One of the most remarkable features of human societies is the tendency to share resources. Evidence from archaeology, anthropology, and studies of more recent hunter-gatherer groups suggests that food sharing was often common. This practice helped reduce risk in an unpredictable world. A hunting expedition might succeed one day and fail the next. Certain plants might be abundant during one season and scarce during another. By distributing food among members of the group, communities increased the likelihood that everyone would survive temporary shortages. Sharing also strengthened social bonds. People who helped one another during difficult times were building relationships that could prove valuable in the future. Cooperation was therefore not merely an act of generosity, it was often a practical strategy that increased the resilience of the entire group. Children grew up observing these patterns. They learned that survival was connected to participation within a community. As they matured, they gradually assumed greater responsibilities, contributing according to their abilities and experience. The transition from childhood to adulthood was not marked solely by age, but by the acquisition of knowledge and skills that benefited others. Over time, each new generation became part of the network of cooperation that had supported previous generations. This system helped communities endure despite environmental challenges, changing seasons, and the uncertainties of life before permanent settlements. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it is tempting to focus only on movement, shelters, or food sources. Yet equally important was the social framework that connected individuals to one another. People survived because they shared labor, knowledge, and resources. They depended on trust built through repeated interactions over many years. The absence of villages did not mean the absence of organization. Instead, organization existed within relationships. Daily life was sustained by countless small acts of cooperation that linked people together into functioning communities. Long before streets, marketplaces, and permanent institutions appeared, humans had already developed powerful ways of working together. Those cooperative habits helped carry our species through most of its history, proving that successful societies can exist even when they leave behind few permanent traces on the landscape. Today, it is easy to store information. A thought can be written down in seconds. A photograph can preserve a moment. A book can survive for centuries, and a digital archive can contain more knowledge than a person could absorb in a lifetime. Because of this, modern people often think of memory as something helpful but imperfect, a backup system used when information is not recorded elsewhere. For most of human history, however, memory was not a backup. Memory was the archive. Before villages, before writing, and before libraries, the survival of entire communities depended upon the ability to remember and to pass important knowledge from one generation to the next. In many ways, memory was one of humanity's earliest and most essential technologies. The challenge facing prehistoric communities was immense. To live successfully within a landscape, people needed to know where water could be found, which plants were safe to eat, where animals migrated, how weather patterns changed throughout the year, and which routes connected important locations. They also needed to remember social relationships, traditions, practical skills, and lessons learned from previous experiences. None of this information could be stored in books because books did not yet exist. There were no maps hanging on walls, no written records, and no databases preserving accumulated knowledge. Everything depended on the human mind. Yet this should not lead us to imagine prehistoric people constantly struggling with forgotten information. Human beings evolved in a world where memory carried extraordinary importance. Knowledge that modern people might record immediately often had to be remembered directly. As a result, communities developed cultural practices that helped preserve information across long periods of time. Repetition, storytelling, observation, participation, and shared experience all contributed to this process. Information was not simply stored by one person. It was distributed across the community. Different individuals carried different forms of knowledge, and together they created a collective memory far larger than any single mind. Elders often played a particularly valuable role in this system. A person who had lived through many seasons possessed experiences that younger members had not yet acquired. They might remember periods of drought, unusual weather, successful hunting locations, or routes that had proven reliable in difficult years. Their value was not measured solely by physical ability, but also by what they knew. In a world without written records, experience itself became a precious resource. Archaeologists cannot directly measure memories from the distant past, but they can observe the results of knowledge being preserved over long periods. The repeated use of particular tool-making techniques, the continued occupation of important locations, and the transmission of cultural practices across generations all suggest that information was being retained and shared successfully. Some stone tool traditions persisted for thousands of years, indicating that complex skills were passed from one generation to another with remarkable consistency. Such continuity would have been impossible without effective systems of learning and memory. Understanding this helps answer an important part of our central question. How did humans live before there were villages? They lived by carrying much of their world inside their minds. Knowledge traveled with people as they moved across landscapes. It could not be left behind in a building or stored in a written archive. Every journey, every season, and every generation depended upon remembering what previous generations had learned. In this sense, memory was more than a mental ability. It was part of the infrastructure of human survival. Long before villages created permanent centers of knowledge, human communities preserved essential information through collective memory, ensuring that wisdom gathered across countless years continued guiding the people who followed after them. Long before written language allowed information to be recorded on clay tablets, parchment, paper, or screens, human beings faced a difficult challenge. Knowledge needed to survive longer than the people who first discovered it. A useful lesson learned by one generation could save lives many generations later, but only if it could be remembered and passed on. Before villages, before schools, and before libraries, one of the most powerful tools for preserving knowledge was the spoken word. Stories, conversations, songs, and oral traditions carried information across decades and sometimes across centuries. To modern ears, a story may sound like entertainment, something told to pass the time after the day's work is finished. For much of human history, stories often served a much larger purpose. They helped communities remember what mattered. A tale shared around a fire could contain practical information about landscapes, animals, weather, social expectations, and survival. It could preserve memories of places visited long ago or events that shaped the experiences of previous generations. In a world without written records, stories became containers for knowledge. This was not necessarily a deliberate process in the way a modern textbook is written. Rather, information became woven into narratives that people could remember more easily than isolated facts. Human minds are naturally drawn to stories. A sequence of events, characters, places, and actions is often easier to recall than a list of instructions. This may be one reason why oral traditions proved so effective over long periods of time. Archaeologists cannot hear the voices of prehistoric people, but evidence from many cultures around the world demonstrates the remarkable ability of oral traditions to preserve information. Even in societies that developed long before writing arrived, complex bodies of knowledge were transmitted successfully through generations. Navigation routes, ecological knowledge, genealogies, seasonal patterns, and cultural practices could all be remembered through repeated storytelling and shared experience. The process depended upon constant participation. Stories were heard many times throughout life, rather than only once. Children listened as adults repeated familiar narratives. Over the years, those children became adults who repeated the same stories to younger listeners. In this way, knowledge moved continuously through the community. The evening fire may have played an especially important role. Archaeological evidence shows that controlled use of fire has a very long history in human life. Beyond providing warmth and protection, fires created spaces where people could gather after the practical tasks of the day were complete. In the glow of a hearth, experiences could be shared, lessons discussed, and memories reinforced. A story about a distant water source might help future travelers. A tale involving an animal could teach important observations about behavior and movement. Narratives about ancestors might preserve social relationships and community identity. The boundary between practical information and cultural tradition was often less distinct than modern people might expect. Knowledge was embedded within the stories people told about themselves and the world around them. Understanding this helps answer an important aspect of how humans lived before there were villages. They did not rely on buildings filled with records or institutions dedicated to preserving information. Instead, knowledge traveled wherever people traveled. It lived in conversations, memories, and traditions carried from one generation to the next. A community could move across a landscape and still retain its accumulated wisdom because that wisdom existed within the people themselves. Long before permanent settlements created archives of stone, clay, or paper, human societies preserved essential knowledge through oral tradition. Across thousands of years, countless lessons survived because people continued telling stories, listening carefully, and remembering what previous generations believed was important enough never to forget. Not all knowledge was equally important in the world before villages. Some information might be interesting, some useful, and some absolutely essential for survival. If a community forgot a story about a distant event, life could continue. If it forgot where to find water during a drought, the consequences could be far more serious. For this reason, generations of people invested enormous effort in remembering certain kinds of knowledge. These were the lessons that allowed communities to navigate landscapes, locate resources, avoid dangers, and adapt to changing conditions. Long before written records existed, human survival depended on identifying what information truly mattered and ensuring that it was passed forward. One of the most valuable forms of knowledge involved the natural world itself. People needed to understand the plants around them in remarkable detail, which fruits could be eaten safely, which roots required preparation before consumption, which plants were useful for medicine, fuel, cordage, or shelter. Such knowledge was often highly specific to particular environments. A community living near a coastline might possess expertise very different from that of people living in forests or grasslands. Yet the principle remained the same. Understanding local resources increased the chances of survival. Equally important was knowledge of animals. Hunters needed to recognize tracks, understand seasonal movements, and predict behavior. Fishers had to know when fish were likely to appear and where they could be found. Even people who rarely hunted directly benefited from knowing how animals interacted with the landscape. These observations helped communities make decisions about movement, food gathering, and seasonal planning. Weather and environmental patterns formed another critical category of knowledge. Before villages, people could not rely on stored harvests large enough to protect them from every difficulty. They needed to anticipate change. The arrival of rains, shifts in temperature, changing winds, and seasonal transitions all influenced where resources would become available. Communities that understood these patterns were better prepared to respond. Over many generations, people accumulated observations that allowed them to recognize signs of approaching environmental changes. Some of this knowledge may have appeared simple on the surface, yet it represented countless years of experience distilled into practical understanding. Navigation was equally important. Modern travelers often depend on maps, signs, and digital tools. Hunter-gatherer communities relied on memory. They remembered routes connecting water sources, seasonal camps, hunting grounds, fishing locations, and gathering areas. Landscapes became filled with meaning. Hills, rivers, unusual rock formations, and other natural features acted as landmarks within mental maps carried from one generation to the next. Losing this knowledge could make movement more dangerous and reduce access to important resources. Social knowledge also mattered. People needed to understand relationships, responsibilities, customs, and expectations within the community. Cooperation was essential to survival, and cooperation depended on shared understanding. Children learned not only where food could be found, but also how to work with others, how resources were shared, and how disagreements could be managed. These lessons helped maintain the stability of small groups, whose members depended heavily upon one another. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it becomes clear that survival depended upon much more than physical strength or simple tools. Success required vast amounts of knowledge carefully preserved and transmitted across generations. Communities carried detailed information about landscapes, plants, animals, weather, routes, and social relationships. Much of what we might call infrastructure today existed in a different form. Instead of roads, maps, and written records, there were memories, traditions, and shared experience. Instead of storing knowledge in buildings, people stored it in minds. For thousands upon thousands of years, this system proved remarkably effective. It enabled human beings to survive, adapt, and expand across diverse environments long before permanent settlements emerged. In many ways, the most important tool carried by our ancestors was not made of stone, wood, or bone. It was the accumulated knowledge that traveled with them wherever they went. In the modern world, people often belong to large systems that extend far beyond the individuals they know personally. We may identify with a city, a nation, an institution, or an organization containing millions of people. Most of us encounter strangers every day, and many of the rules that shape our lives are enforced by systems we rarely see directly. Before villages, however, human social life operated on a much smaller scale. The communities that carried humanity through most of its history were built not upon governments, written laws, or permanent settlements, but upon relationships. To understand how humans lived before there were villages, we must understand what held those communities together. The answer was often found in networks of kinship, trust, memory, and shared experience. In a small hunter-gatherer group, people usually knew one another personally. Daily life unfolded among individuals who interacted constantly over many years. Children grew up alongside the same companions. Adults worked together, traveled together, shared food, and relied upon one another during difficult times. Because survival depended so heavily on cooperation, relationships carried enormous practical importance. A person's connection to the group was not an abstract concept. It influenced access to support, information, resources, and protection. Kinship often formed an important part of this social framework. Biological relatives played significant roles, but human communities were rarely limited to immediate family alone. Extended networks of relatives could connect people across multiple groups and regions. These relationships created opportunities for cooperation that extended beyond a single camp. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct every social connection from the distant past, yet studies of hunter-gatherer societies suggest that such networks often helped communities maintain resilience. If resources became scarce in one area, connections with people elsewhere could provide opportunities for assistance, information, or temporary relocation. In this sense, social relationships functioned as a form of security. Trust was another essential element. In a world where people depended on one another for survival, trust had practical value. Sharing food, caring for children, exchanging knowledge, and cooperating during difficult tasks all required confidence that others would contribute when needed. Trust was built gradually through repeated interaction. People learned who could be relied upon because they observed one another over long periods of time. Reputation therefore mattered. Actions were remembered. Reliability strengthened social bonds, while repeated failures could weaken them. Since communities were relatively small, individual behavior often had visible consequences for the group as a whole. Shared traditions also helped create a sense of belonging. Stories, rituals, customs, and collective memories connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Even without permanent villages, communities developed identities shaped by common experiences and inherited knowledge. These traditions helped explain who people were, where they came from, and how they should relate to one another. In a constantly changing world, cultural continuity provided stability. A person might move between camps throughout the year, but the shared traditions of the group remained familiar. This continuity helped strengthen social cohesion, despite physical mobility. When we ask what connected people before villages existed, it becomes clear that social bonds often served functions later performed by institutions. Relationships helped distribute resources. Kinship networks linked communities together. Shared traditions preserved identity. Trust enabled cooperation. None of these required permanent buildings or formal governments. They emerged from daily interactions repeated across generations. Long before streets, borders, and administrative systems organized human life, people built societies through relationships. The communities that survived across most of human history were held together not by walls or laws carved into stone, but by connections between individuals who depended upon one another and understood that their futures were closely linked. In the world before villages, belonging was not defined by where you lived. It was defined by the people with whom you shared your life. One of the assumptions many modern people make is that large-scale cooperation requires formal authority. We are accustomed to governments, laws, courts, police forces, and institutions that help organize interactions among millions of people. Because these systems are so familiar, it can be difficult to imagine how communities functioned before villages existed. Yet for most of human history, people lived in groups that operated without centralized governments, written legal codes, or permanent administrative structures. This does not mean they lived without rules or social order. On the contrary, cooperation was essential to survival, and communities developed ways of maintaining stability long before formal institutions appeared. Understanding these systems helps answer an important part of our central question: how did humans live together before there were villages? In small hunter-gatherer communities, social relationships were often direct and personal. People interacted with one another repeatedly over many years. Unlike modern cities, where individuals may encounter strangers constantly, prehistoric groups were typically composed of people who knew each other well. This familiarity influenced behavior in important ways. Actions were visible, contributions were noticed. Failures to cooperate could be remembered. Because relationships were long-term, individuals had strong incentives to maintain trust and goodwill within the community. Cooperation was not enforced primarily through distant authorities. It was supported through ongoing social connections. Reputation became an important form of social currency. People who shared resources, fulfilled responsibilities, and contributed to the well-being of others strengthened their standing within the group. Those who consistently acted in ways that harmed cooperation could face social consequences. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have observed a variety of mechanisms through which communities encourage cooperation, including discussion, persuasion, criticism, and the influence of social expectations. While the details vary widely across cultures, the broader pattern suggests that many small societies maintained order through relationships rather than formal institutions. Another important factor was the scale of the community itself. Smaller groups often face different challenges than large populations. When people know one another personally, communication can occur more directly. Problems may be addressed through conversation rather than through complex bureaucratic systems. Decisions affecting the group can sometimes involve participation from many members, rather than being delegated to distant authorities. Archaeological evidence cannot reveal every detail of how decisions were made tens of thousands of years ago, but it suggests that human societies functioned successfully in small groups for an extraordinarily long period before permanent villages emerged. This success indicates that effective forms of social coordination existed even in the absence of centralized government. Cooperation was also supported by shared dependence. Members of a community relied upon one another for food, knowledge, childcare, protection, and companionship. The survival of individuals was often closely linked to the survival of the group. This interdependence encouraged behaviors that strengthened collective resilience. Sharing food after a successful hunt, assisting with childcare, helping maintain shelters, or teaching important skills, all contributed to a network of mutual support. Such actions benefited others, but they also increased the likelihood that support would be available when needed in return. Over time, Patterns of reciprocity helped sustain cooperation across generations. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it becomes clear that social order did not begin with governments or permanent settlements. Human beings had already spent hundreds of thousands of years developing ways to cooperate, resolve problems, and maintain group cohesion. Their systems were often rooted in personal relationships rather than formal institutions. Trust, reputation, reciprocity, and shared expectations formed the foundations of community life. These mechanisms were not perfect, and disagreements undoubtedly occurred, as they do in every human society. Yet they proved effective enough to support countless generations of people living, traveling, learning, and surviving together. Long before villages introduced new forms of organization, humans had already mastered the art of cooperation on a scale that matched the realities of their world. It is easy to imagine the world before villages as a collection of small, isolated groups scattered across vast landscapes, each living independently with little contact beyond its immediate community. At first glance, this assumption seems reasonable. Without roads, cities, or permanent settlements, communication across long distances appears difficult. Yet, archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that prehistoric human societies were often more connected than we might expect. While most people spent their daily lives within relatively small groups, those groups were rarely completely cut off from one another. Instead, they often formed parts of larger social networks that stretched across regions and sometimes over surprisingly large distances. Understanding these connections is important because they reveal another way humans successfully lived before villages. They survived not only through cooperation within communities but also through relationships that extended beyond them. One clue comes from the movement of materials. Archaeologists have discovered objects made from stone, shells, pigments, and other resources that originated far from the places where they were eventually found. In some cases, these materials appear to have traveled dozens or even hundreds of kilometers through a series of exchanges and interactions. This does not necessarily mean that a single individual carried an object across the entire distance. More likely, materials moved gradually through networks connecting different groups. Such findings suggest that people maintained relationships beyond their immediate communities and that information, resources, and cultural practices could spread across large areas. These networks offered practical benefits. Life before villages was often unpredictable. Environmental conditions changed, food resources fluctuated, local shortages could occur. Connections with neighboring groups created opportunities for cooperation during difficult periods. A community facing challenges in one region might obtain information about conditions elsewhere. Knowledge of distant water sources, seasonal resources, or safer travel routes could become valuable during times of uncertainty. Social networks, therefore, functioned as a form of resilience, expanding the range of options available when local circumstances became difficult. Meetings between groups may also have served important social purposes. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have observed that gatherings can provide opportunities to strengthen relationships, exchange information, arrange partnerships, and reinforce cultural traditions. While the details undoubtedly varied across different regions and time periods, similar dynamics may have existed throughout much of prehistory. People did not necessarily encounter strangers as often as individuals living in modern cities, but neither were they confined permanently to a single, small circle of acquaintances. Over the course of a lifetime, many individuals likely interacted with members of multiple communities, connected through kinship, shared traditions, or seasonal movements. These encounters helped maintain broader social networks that extended beyond any one camp. Cultural ideas could travel through these connections as well. A useful tool-making technique, a new hunting strategy, or a particular way of processing food might gradually spread from one group to another. Archaeological evidence shows that certain technologies and cultural traditions appeared across wide geographic areas, suggesting that knowledge was not always confined to isolated populations. Information moved because people interacted. This exchange of ideas contributed to human adaptability by allowing innovations to spread beyond the communities where they first emerged. Understanding this helps answer a deeper question about life before villages. Human societies were not simply collections of independent groups surviving alone in separate territories. They were often linked through networks of relationships, exchanges, and shared knowledge. The scale of these networks differed from the large institutions of later civilizations, but they nonetheless connected people across considerable distances. Long before villages created permanent centers of population, humans had already developed ways of building relationships beyond the boundaries of their immediate communities. Through meetings, exchanges, shared traditions, and social connections, they created networks that carried resources, information, and cultural knowledge across the landscape. In doing so, they transformed a world of small mobile groups into a broader web of human relationships, one that quietly connected people long before the first village ever appeared. For most of human history, mobility was one of the great strengths of our species. Communities moved when resources changed, when seasons shifted, and when opportunities appeared elsewhere. Yet mobility was never an absolute rule. Even in a world before villages, some places were simply better than others. Certain locations offered such reliable access to food, water, and shelter that people could remain there for longer periods without facing the same pressures that encouraged movement elsewhere. Understanding these exceptional places helps explain how the first steps toward permanent settlement may have begun. Villages did not appear suddenly. They emerged gradually from changes in the relationship between people and the landscapes they inhabited. One of the most important factors was the presence of dependable resources. In many environments, food sources change dramatically throughout the year. A productive area during one season might provide very little during another. But some locations were unusually rich and predictable. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, estuaries, and certain coastal regions could supply food across extended periods of time. Fish, shellfish, waterfowl, edible plants, and other resources often gathered around these environments, creating opportunities that were not available everywhere. Archaeological evidence from several parts of the world suggests that communities sometimes returned to such locations repeatedly over generations. The reason was simple. These places consistently offered what people needed to survive. Water played a particularly important role. Reliable access to fresh water attracted not only humans but also animals and plant life. Where water remained available year after year, the surrounding environment often became more productive. A river valley could support fish populations, encourage the growth of edible vegetation, and attract herds of animals seeking water. Instead of relying on a single resource, people could draw from many different sources concentrated within a relatively small area. This diversity reduced uncertainty. If one resource became temporarily scarce, others might still be available. Such conditions made longer stays increasingly practical. Climate also influenced these patterns. Toward the end of the last ice age, some regions experienced environmental changes that created new opportunities for human communities. As temperatures gradually warmed in many areas, ecosystems shifted. Forests expanded in some places, wetlands developed in others. New combinations of plants and animals appeared across changing landscapes. While these changes varied greatly from region to region, they sometimes increased the availability of resources that could support larger populations for longer periods. People did not suddenly stop moving, but in certain locations movement became less necessary than it had been before. Archaeologists have identified sites where evidence suggests repeated occupation over extended periods. Layers of tools, hearths, food remains, and other traces indicate that people returned again and again to the same locations. These sites were not yet villages in the later sense. Permanent buildings were often absent, and communities still maintained elements of mobility. Yet something important was changing. Certain places were becoming more central to people's lives. Instead of functioning merely as temporary stops within seasonal journeys, they began serving as recurring hubs where communities spent increasing amounts of time. Understanding this helps answer a key question in our exploration of how humans lived before there were villages. The transition towards settled life did not begin because people suddenly abandoned their traditional ways of living. It began because some landscapes offered new possibilities. Where resources were abundant, reliable, and concentrated, remaining in one place became increasingly practical. The advantages of mobility did not disappear, but they no longer carried the same weight in every environment. Gradually, in a few fortunate locations, people found themselves returning more often, staying longer, and building deeper connections to particular places. Long before the first true villages appeared, the foundations of change were already taking shape in these resource-rich landscapes, where nature itself created conditions that encouraged a different relationship between humans and the land. As human communities became increasingly successful at finding and using reliable sources of food, another gradual change began to shape the course of history. More children survived into adulthood. Knowledge accumulated across generations. Groups expanded, sometimes dividing into smaller communities, and sometimes maintaining broader networks of relationships. Population growth was not a sudden event, nor did it occur at the same pace everywhere. Yet, over long periods of time, even small increases in the number of people could create new challenges. A landscape that comfortably supported a few dozen individuals might become more difficult to manage if significantly more people depended upon the same resources. Understanding this process helps explain why some communities eventually began spending longer periods in particular places, and why the transition toward village life may have become increasingly attractive in certain regions. For highly mobile hunter-gatherer groups, movement offered many advantages, but it also carried practical limitations. Traveling across large distances required energy, possessions had to be carried. Young children needed protection and care. Older individuals could face additional difficulties during long journeys. When populations remained relatively small, these challenges were often manageable. However, as communities grew larger, maintaining the same degree of mobility could become more complicated. A larger group required more food each day. Camps occupied by many people could place greater pressure on local resources. Coordinating movement among numerous individuals also demanded careful planning and cooperation. These realities did not make mobility impossible, but they sometimes encouraged new ways of organizing life. Archaeological evidence from several regions suggests that some communities began spending increasing amounts of time in resource-rich locations capable of supporting larger populations. Rivers, lakes, coastal environments, and productive valleys often provided enough food to sustain people for extended periods. In such places, the benefits of remaining nearby could outweigh the advantages of constant movement. Rather than traveling long distances in search of resources, people could obtain much of what they needed within a smaller area. This shift did not happen everywhere, and many communities continued mobile lifestyles for thousands of years. Nevertheless, in certain environments, larger populations and abundant resources began influencing human behavior in subtle but important ways. The relationship between population size and social life also deserves attention. Small groups often function through direct personal relationships because nearly everyone knows one another well. As populations increase, social networks become more complex. Communities may develop new customs, traditions, and forms of cooperation to maintain cohesion. Archaeologists studying prehistoric sites sometimes find evidence suggesting that larger gatherings occurred at particular locations. These places may have served as seasonal meeting points where multiple groups came together to exchange information, strengthen social ties, share resources, and participate in communal activities. Such gatherings reveal that human societies were already experimenting with new forms of organization long before permanent villages became widespread. Another important factor involved children. Human beings have unusually long childhoods compared to many other species. Raising children requires significant investment of time, energy, and resources. In environments where food was reliable and movement less necessary, families may have found certain advantages in remaining near productive locations for longer periods. Stability could reduce some of the burdens associated with frequent travel, while providing easier access to food and social support. Over generations, these practical considerations may have contributed to changes in settlement patterns. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it is important to remember that the transition towards settled life was not driven by a single invention or decision. It emerged from many interconnected factors, unfolding gradually across long stretches of time. Population growth was one of those factors. As communities became larger and more successful, some landscapes that had once supported seasonal visits began supporting longer occupations. People did not abandon mobility overnight. Instead, they slowly adapted to new opportunities and new challenges. In a few regions blessed with abundant resources, growing populations and changing social needs encouraged communities to remain in place for longer periods than their ancestors had. These subtle shifts did not yet create villages, but they helped prepare the conditions from which villages would eventually emerge. When modern people think about villages, they often imagine a clear beginning. A group of people chooses a location, builds permanent homes, and a village suddenly exists. The archaeological record suggests that reality was usually much less dramatic. The boundary between a temporary camp and a permanent settlement was often blurred. Change unfolded gradually across generations, sometimes so slowly that the people experiencing it may not have recognized it as a transformation at all. Before the first true villages appeared, there were many places that occupied a middle ground between constant mobility and full-time settlement. Understanding these places helps us see how one way of life slowly evolved into another. Archaeologists occasionally discover sites that show evidence of repeated occupation over long periods. Layer upon layer of hearths, stone tools, food remains, and other traces reveal that people return to the same locations again and again. At first, such returns may have been seasonal. A riverside camp could be occupied during a productive fishing season and then left behind when resources declined. Yet over time, some sites began showing signs that people were staying longer. Structures became more substantial. Evidence of repeated rebuilding appeared. Activities that once occurred briefly became concentrated in the same place across multiple years or generations. These patterns suggest that certain locations were becoming increasingly important within the lives of the communities that used them. One reason this transition is difficult to identify is that permanence exists on a spectrum rather than as a simple yes or no condition. A group might spend only part of the year in a particular location while still returning to it so consistently that it became a central place within their annual cycle. Another group might construct shelters designed to last longer than a single season, while continuing to maintain connections with other locations. Such communities were neither fully mobile nor fully settled by later standards. They occupied an intermediate stage that challenges modern categories. The archaeological record often captures these gradual shifts more clearly than it reveals exact moments of change. Material evidence also suggests that people sometimes invested increasing effort in specific places. A temporary shelter intended for short use may require relatively little construction. A site expected to be used repeatedly, however, can justify greater investment of labor. More durable structures, storage features, prepared living spaces, and repeated modifications all indicate a growing commitment to particular locations. Importantly, these developments did not appear everywhere at the same time. Different regions followed different paths depending on local environments, available resources, and cultural traditions. There was no single moment when humanity collectively decided to settle down. Instead, many communities experimented with different ways of balancing mobility and permanence. Storage may have played an especially significant role in this process. Highly mobile groups generally benefit from keeping possessions lightweight and portable, but in locations where people expected to return regularly, storing resources for future use could become advantageous. Archaeological evidence from some regions suggests that storage practices became increasingly important as communities spent more time in productive locations. The ability to preserve food or useful materials created new possibilities. People no longer needed to carry everything with them. Gradually, places themselves began holding part of a community's accumulated resources. This subtle change strengthened the connection between people and specific locations. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, it becomes clear that the answer cannot be divided neatly into two separate worlds, one mobile and one settled. Between those extremes existed a long period of experimentation and adaptation. Communities returned to favored locations, built more durable shelters, stored resources, and developed deeper ties to particular landscapes. None of these changes immediately created villages, but together they laid the groundwork for what would come next. Long before permanent settlements dominated human life, there were camps that began to feel less temporary, places where each return added another layer of memory, effort, and connection. In those gradually changing landscapes, the first outlines of village life were beginning to emerge, not through sudden invention, but through countless small decisions repeated across generations. For thousands of years, human communities had survived through movement. They followed seasonal resources, adapted to changing landscapes, and carried their knowledge wherever they went. Yet in some parts of the world, a new pattern slowly began to emerge. Certain groups started spending so much time in particular locations that those places became more than recurring camps. They became communities with a stronger sense of permanence. The first villages did not appear everywhere at once, nor did they look like the towns and cities familiar today. They were often modest collections of dwellings occupied by relatively small populations. Even so, they represented one of the most significant changes in the entire history of human life. To understand how humans lived before there were villages, it is useful to examine what made these early settlements different from the camps that came before them. One important difference was the growing permanence of structures. Temporary camps often relied on shelters designed for short-term use. These shelters served immediate needs and could be abandoned when a group moved elsewhere. In contrast, some of the earliest villages show evidence of buildings constructed with the expectation that they would remain useful for extended periods. Archaeological discoveries from various regions reveal houses built from stone, mud, timber, or combinations of local materials. These structures required greater investments of labor than temporary shelters. Building them made sense because people expected to remain nearby or return repeatedly. A house was no longer simply protection from the weather. It was becoming part of a long-term relationship with a specific place. Another important change involved storage. Mobile communities generally benefited from carrying only what they could transport. Early villages created opportunities to keep resources in one location. Archaeologists have discovered storage pits, containers, and other features suggesting that people increasingly preserved food and materials for future use. This ability changed daily life in subtle but profound ways. Resources gathered during one season could support people during another. Communities became somewhat less dependent on immediate environmental conditions because they could draw upon supplies accumulated earlier. While uncertainty never disappeared, storage helped reduce some of the risks associated with seasonal fluctuations. Population density also began to change. In highly mobile societies, people were often distributed across landscapes according to available resources. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements allowed larger numbers of individuals to remain together for longer periods. This created new social opportunities. Knowledge could be shared more frequently. Cooperation could occur on a larger scale. Relationships became increasingly intertwined as people spent more of their lives in close proximity to one another. At the same time, living near more people also introduced new challenges. Disagreements, resource management, and social coordination became more complex as communities grew. The advantages of settlement arrived alongside responsibilities that earlier mobile groups had experienced differently. The connection between people and place also deepened. A temporary camp might hold memories, but a village accumulated them continuously. Generations could grow up in the same location. Buildings could be repaired, modified, and rebuilt. Burial places, gathering areas, and shared spaces strengthened a community's attachment to its surroundings. The landscape was no longer simply a place visited during a seasonal cycle. It was becoming a permanent center of social life. This transformation affected how people thought about belonging, continuity, and the future. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we often focus on what was absent: permanent homes, fixed settlements, and long-term residence. Yet the first villages reveal what happened when some communities gradually moved beyond those earlier patterns. They did not abandon all aspects of their past. Many traditions of cooperation, knowledge sharing, and adaptation continued. What changed was the growing importance of place itself. The earliest villages represented a new experiment in human living, one in which people invested increasing amounts of time, labor, and memory into a single location. These settlements were still simple by later standards, but they marked the beginning of a profound shift. For the first time in many regions, the center of human life was no longer moving through the landscape. The landscape itself was beginning to hold people in place. As the first villages began to appear in different parts of the world, they offered something that mobile communities could rarely achieve to the same degree: continuity in one place. For countless generations, movement had been a successful strategy. It allowed people to adapt to changing environments, follow resources, and reduce risks associated with local shortages. Yet when certain communities found themselves living in especially productive locations, the advantages of remaining nearby became increasingly difficult to ignore. The emergence of villages was not simply a matter of convenience. It reflected a growing recognition that permanent or semi-permanent settlement could provide new opportunities that were difficult to achieve through constant mobility alone. One of the most obvious benefits was stability. When people remained in one location for longer periods, they could invest more effort in improving their surroundings. A temporary camp rarely justifies extensive construction because it may soon be abandoned. A village, however, encourages long-term planning. Houses can be repaired and expanded, shared spaces can be maintained, storage facilities can be improved. Over time, these investments accumulate, gradually creating a living environment that becomes more comfortable and predictable than a temporary shelter. Each generation inherits not only knowledge from those who came before, but also physical improvements made to the settlement itself. This continuity allows communities to build upon previous efforts rather than beginning again from scratch each season. Food management also changed in important ways. In earlier mobile lifestyles, people often depended heavily on resources that were available at specific times and places. Villages made it easier to store food and other materials for future use. Archaeological evidence suggests that storage became increasingly significant in many early settlements. The ability to preserve resources reduced some of the uncertainty associated with seasonal fluctuations. A successful harvest, productive fishing season, or abundant gathering period could continue supporting a community long after the resources had been collected. This did not eliminate risk entirely, but it created a buffer against short-term shortages and environmental variation. Living in larger, more stable communities also created new possibilities for cooperation. When people remain together for extended periods, opportunities for sharing knowledge increase. Skills can become more specialized because individuals interact frequently and can rely on others for support. One person may develop particular expertise in toolmaking, another in food preparation, another in construction, and another in preserving cultural traditions. Such specialization does not appear overnight, but permanent settlements create conditions in which it can gradually expand. As knowledge becomes distributed across a larger population, communities gain access to a wider range of abilities and experiences. Villages also strengthened connections between generations. In mobile societies, knowledge traveled with people. In settled communities, knowledge could become associated with specific places. Children grew up surrounded by structures, landmarks, and traditions that connected them directly to earlier generations. The physical environment itself became part of collective memory. A house rebuilt many times, a shared gathering space, or a location associated with important events could help preserve a sense of continuity across decades. People were no longer simply carrying their history through the landscape. Increasingly, their history was becoming embedded within a particular location. Yet these advantages came with new responsibilities. The more people depended upon one place, the more they depended upon the resources surrounding it. Managing food supplies, maintaining relationships among larger populations, and caring for shared spaces required ongoing effort. The very stability that villages provided could also create challenges that mobile groups had often avoided through movement. These difficulties would become increasingly important as settlements grew larger and more complex. But for many communities, the benefits of remaining in productive locations were significant enough to encourage continued settlement. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we see a world shaped by flexibility and movement. When villages began to emerge, they introduced a different possibility, a life rooted in continuity, accumulated effort, and long-term investment in a single place. For some communities, that new possibility proved powerful enough to transform the course of human history. The first villages brought new opportunities, but they also introduced challenges that earlier generations of mobile people had encountered far less often. For hundreds of thousands of years, human communities had responded to problems largely through movement. If resources became scarce in one area, people could often relocate. If environmental conditions changed, they could adapt by following new opportunities elsewhere. Settlement altered this relationship between humans and the landscape. The more time a community invested in a particular place, the more difficult it became to simply leave when difficulties arose. In many ways, the advantages of village life and its challenges emerged together. The same permanence that provided stability also created new forms of dependence. One of the most significant challenges involved resources. A mobile group moving across a large territory typically distributed its activities across many environments. A settled community concentrated more people in a smaller area for longer periods. This increased pressure on local resources. Firewood had to be collected. Water remained essential. Food supplies had to support a larger and more stable population. If resources were abundant, these demands could be managed successfully. However, when conditions changed unexpectedly, the consequences could affect many people at once. A poor harvest, environmental disruption, or decline in available food sources could create difficulties that were not easily solved by short-term movement. Communities increasingly needed ways to plan ahead and manage uncertainty. Population density created additional complexities. In small mobile groups, social tensions certainly existed, but people often had greater flexibility in how they organized themselves across the landscape. Villages brought larger numbers of individuals into closer and more continuous contact. Shared spaces became more crowded. Decisions about resources, responsibilities, and daily activities affected more people than before. Maintaining cooperation remained possible, but it often required greater coordination. The social skills that had supported human communities for thousands of years became even more important as populations grew. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct every disagreement that occurred in the distant past, yet the growth of settled communities almost certainly introduced new questions about how people organized collective life and resolved competing interests. Health may also have been affected in some circumstances. Mobile populations often interacted with the environment differently than settled populations. When larger numbers of people lived together for extended periods, waste management, food storage, and close contact between individuals became increasingly significant factors. The exact effects varied greatly depending on location, lifestyle, and environmental conditions, but settlement introduced new relationships between humans, resources, and disease. These developments unfolded gradually and differently across regions, reminding us that village life was not automatically easier in every respect. It offered benefits, but those benefits carried responsibilities that earlier ways of living had often distributed across broader landscapes. Another subtle change involved people's connection to place itself. For mobile communities, identity was often closely linked to movement through familiar territories. Villages encouraged a stronger attachment to specific locations. Houses, storage areas, gathering places, and burial grounds accumulated meaning over time. Leaving such places behind became increasingly difficult, not only for practical reasons but also for emotional and social ones. The village was no longer simply where people happened to be. It became part of who they were. This deeper attachment strengthened communities in many ways, yet it also made adaptation more complicated when circumstances demanded change. Understanding these challenges helps answer an important question about how humans lived before there were villages. The mobile way of life was not merely an incomplete version of settlement waiting to be replaced. It possessed strengths that had allowed humanity to thrive across vast stretches of time and geography. When villages emerged, they created remarkable new possibilities, but they also introduced trade-offs. People gained stability while accepting new responsibilities. They accumulated resources while becoming more dependent on particular places. They built larger communities while facing more complex social demands. The transition from mobility to settlement was therefore not a simple story of progress from one stage to another. It was a transformation that reshaped nearly every aspect of human life. By the time the first villages became established, humanity had entered a new chapter, one filled with opportunities that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined, yet also with challenges that would continue shaping human societies for thousands of years to come. As we approach the end of this long journey into the world before villages, a remarkable realization begins to emerge. For most of human history, people lived without permanent settlements, without streets, without fields stretching across the horizon, and without many of the institutions that modern societies often take for granted. Yet they were not merely surviving in a harsh and uncertain world. They were building families, raising children, sharing knowledge, adapting to changing environments, and creating communities capable of enduring for generation after generation. The question is no longer simply how humans lived before there were villages. The deeper question is what allowed them to do so successfully for such an extraordinary length of time. One answer appears again and again throughout the archaeological record: adaptability. Human beings did not depend upon a single environment, a single food source, or a single way of life. They learned to live in forests, grasslands, river valleys, deserts, mountains, coastlines, and countless other landscapes. When conditions changed, people adjusted their behavior rather than expecting the world to remain constant. They followed seasonal opportunities, observed environmental patterns, and accumulated knowledge that allowed them to respond to uncertainty. This flexibility became one of the defining characteristics of our species. Long before villages appeared, adaptability had already helped humans spread across vast portions of the planet. Knowledge was equally important. Again and again, we have seen that life before villages depended not only on physical strength or simple tools, but on information. People needed to understand plants, animals, weather, water sources, seasonal cycles, and social relationships. They needed to remember routes across landscapes and recognize subtle signs within their environments. This knowledge could not be stored in books, because books did not yet exist. Instead, it lived within communities. Elders preserved experience. Stories carried lessons. Daily life became a continuous process of teaching and learning. The ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next allowed human societies to accumulate wisdom over immense stretches of time. Cooperation formed another essential foundation. No individual could easily thrive alone in the world before villages. People relied upon one another for food, childcare, protection, companionship, and the sharing of information. Small communities succeeded because members contributed in different ways according to their skills and circumstances. Resources were often shared. Responsibilities were distributed. Relationships created networks of support that increased resilience during difficult periods. The strength of these social bonds helps explain why humans flourished long before large settlements, governments, and formal institutions appeared. Community itself was one of humanity's most powerful tools. Perhaps most importantly, people learned how to live within the rhythms of the natural world rather than attempting to control every aspect of it. Before villages, survival often depended on understanding change rather than resisting it. The movement of animals, the arrival of rains, the growth of plants, and the shifting of seasons all influenced human decisions. Communities paid attention to these patterns because their lives depended upon them. The natural world was not a distant background to human activity. It was an active participant in everyday life. People adapted their movements, schedules, and expectations to the realities of the environments around them. This relationship demanded patience, observation, and humility. When we look back across this immense span of history, it becomes clear that the people who lived before villages were not waiting for civilization to begin. They had already developed sophisticated ways of understanding their world. They had already created systems for sharing knowledge, raising families, maintaining social bonds, and surviving across diverse environments. Villages would eventually transform human life in profound ways, but they were built upon foundations that had been established long before the first permanent settlements appeared. The story of life before villages is therefore not a story of absence. It is a story of skills, relationships, memory, and adaptability. It is the story of how countless generations of human beings learned to thrive in a changing world, carrying with them the knowledge and cooperation that would eventually make every later chapter of human history possible. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of human history. When most people imagine the past, they often picture villages, farms, roads, and eventually cities. Permanent settlements seem so central to civilization that it is easy to assume they have always been part of the human story. Yet the opposite is true. For the overwhelming majority of our existence as a species, there were no villages. Long before walls were raised, fields were cultivated, or houses stood side by side in permanent communities, human beings had already spread across continents, adapted to vastly different environments, and developed rich social lives. In terms of time, the world before villages was not a brief introduction to history. It was history. Everything that came later was built upon foundations established during that much longer chapter. This realization invites us to reconsider what progress means. Modern societies often view permanent settlement as a natural destination, the point toward which earlier forms of life were inevitably moving. Yet the archaeological record presents a more complicated picture. The people who lived before villages were not simply waiting for a better way of life to arrive. They had already developed highly effective strategies for surviving and thriving in diverse environments. Their mobility allowed them to respond to changing conditions. Their social networks connected communities across large regions. Their knowledge of landscapes, plants, animals, and seasonal cycles was often extraordinarily detailed. The success of these systems is evident in a simple fact: they worked. They sustained human populations for hundreds of thousands of years. When villages eventually appeared, they introduced important advantages, but they also brought new challenges. Looking back, it becomes difficult to describe one way of life as universally superior to the other. The contrast between mobile and settled communities reveals different solutions to the same fundamental problem: how human beings can live together successfully in a changing world. The mobile communities we have explored throughout this journey possessed strengths that are sometimes overlooked today. Flexibility was one of them. If environmental conditions shifted, people could adapt by moving. If resources became scarce in one area, they could seek opportunities elsewhere. Their lives required careful observation of the natural world and a deep understanding of local environments. Knowledge traveled with them, carried in memory, stories, traditions, and relationships. Their communities were not built from stone and timber alone. They were built from cooperation, trust, and shared experience. These qualities left fewer visible traces than villages and monuments, but they were no less important. In many ways, the archaeological record itself influences how we think about the past. Permanent settlements leave behind structures that can survive for thousands of years. Stone walls, foundations, storage pits, and other physical remains are easier to discover than conversations, relationships, and memories. As a result, village life often appears more visible in history, yet visibility is not the same as importance. The countless generations who lived before villages shaped the development of human behavior, culture, and knowledge long before permanent settlements existed. Their achievements are woven into the story of our species, even when they are harder to see. When we ask how humans lived before there were villages, we are really asking how people succeeded during the longest chapter of human existence. The answer is not found in a single invention or breakthrough. It lies in a collection of abilities developed over immense spans of time: adaptability, cooperation, memory, curiosity, and the capacity to learn from one another. These qualities allowed people to flourish without permanent settlements for far longer than they have lived within them. As we reflect on this history, an intriguing possibility emerges. Perhaps the world before villages was not an incomplete version of the world that followed. Perhaps it was a complete and successful way of life in its own right, one that deserves to be understood not as a primitive beginning, but as one of the most enduring chapters in the entire human story. And if that is true, what lessons about resilience, community, and adaptation might still be waiting for us there today? Our journey began with a simple question: how did humans live before there were villages? At first, the answer may have seemed straightforward. They moved across landscapes, gathered food, hunted animals, built temporary shelters, and followed the changing seasons. Yet as we traveled deeper into this distant past, a far richer picture emerged. We discovered that the world before villages was not an empty prelude to civilization. It was a vast chapter of human history filled with knowledge, relationships, adaptation, and achievement. For hundreds of thousands of years, people found ways to thrive without permanent settlements. They raised families, cared for children, passed on traditions, solved problems, and built communities that endured across generations. Their lives were different from ours, but they were no less human. Again and again, we saw that survival depended on qualities that remain familiar today. People observed the world around them with extraordinary attention. They learned where water could be found, when animals would migrate, which plants could be eaten, and how landscapes changed throughout the year. They shared information through stories, memory, and daily experience. They depended upon one another during times of abundance and times of scarcity. Cooperation was not simply a moral ideal, it was a practical necessity. No individual carried all the knowledge required to survive. No person succeeded entirely alone. Communities endured because people worked together, taught one another, and built relationships strong enough to withstand uncertainty. We also discovered that the appearance of villages was not a sudden revolution. It was the result of countless small changes unfolding across many generations. Certain places offered reliable resources. Some communities began staying longer. Storage became more useful. Houses became more durable. Gradually, the balance between movement and permanence shifted. What emerged were the first villages, not as an abrupt break from the past, but as a continuation of skills and traditions that had already been refined over immense stretches of time. The people who built those early settlements carried with them knowledge inherited from ancestors who had never lived in villages at all. In that sense, village life did not replace the earlier world, it grew from it. Perhaps the most important lesson hidden within this history is that human success has never depended on a single way of living. Our species survived because it remained flexible. Different environments required different solutions. Different challenges demanded different responses. What united these diverse communities was not a particular technology or settlement pattern, but an ability to learn, adapt, cooperate, and pass knowledge forward. These qualities allowed humans to flourish long before cities, kingdoms, written records, or permanent settlements became common. They remain important today, even if the circumstances of our lives have changed dramatically. Modern people often live surrounded by systems so large and complex that it is easy to forget how much still depends upon trust, shared knowledge, and cooperation. The story of life before villages reminds us that these foundations are far older than any building or institution. They were present long before walls marked boundaries or roads connected settlements. They emerged wherever people worked together to understand their world and support one another within it. If there is an educational message to carry forward from this journey, it may be this: the strength of humanity has never come solely from what we build, but from what we learn, remember, and share. Across hundreds of thousands of years, generations of people survived not because they controlled every aspect of their environment, but because they adapted to it, observed it carefully, and relied upon one another. Their story is a reminder that resilience often begins with curiosity, cooperation, and the willingness to learn from those who came before us. And as we drift away from the world before villages and return to our own, perhaps one quiet question remains. If so much of human history was shaped not by permanent places but by relationships, memory, and adaptation, which of those ancient strengths are we still carrying with us today, and which have we quietly forgotten?